we will immediately move on to the next session.
70 years of
India-Japan relations reflections. We have an excellent list of panelists for discussing this particular topic. Ambassador Deepa, Wadhwa, former Indian ambassador to Japan, will chair the session. Professor Purnendra Jain, Emeritus Professor, University at Adelaide, will be speaking, and also Professor Srabani Choudhury, Professor Jain, and Professor Gbc Naidu, Professor retired Jain, will also speaking in the session.
Allow me to briefly introduce the chair.
Ambassador Deepa Wadhwa. Ambassador Deepa Wadhwa, Gopalan Wadhwa, has been a distinguished career diplomat who joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1979 and retired in December 2015. She has served as Ambassador of India to Japan, Qatar, and Sweden. She was concurrently accredited as Ambassador to Latvia and Republic of the Marshall Islands. And during her career, she has also held other significant assignments in China, Geneva, the Netherlands, the International Labour Organization, and the Ministry of External Affairs. Ambassador Wadhwa is currently the chairperson of India-Japan Friendship Forum, member governing council of the Institute of Chinese Studies, and is also on the governing council of the Asian Conference. She also serves as the independent director and advisor on the boards of many companies. Ambassador Wadhwa, please conduct the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jojen. It's such a great pleasure to be here. This is the first substantive session we have after that wonderful introduction. And one must thank, of course, Director General of the ICWA, Mrs. Vijay Thakur Singh. And this gave us an opportunity not only to hear her, and she set the tone for what is going to be a rather full day of various discussions and deliberations on this really important relationship, the India-Japan relationship. And we also heard two present-day practitioners who are pushing this relationship forward. And one is Ambassador Sanjay Kumar Verma, a dear friend, old colleague, and one hears such wonderful things about what he has done to really be able to advance this relationship. And Kawazu-san, CDA at the Japanese Embassy in New Delhi. But I think I was really so happy to connect virtually, if it may be, with Ambassador Hirabayashi, who is the president of the Japan-India Association. And I'll tell you something about this relationship. We're looking at 70 years, but we have a Japan-India Association, the first ever friendship association of this sort, which is more than almost 120 years old. And I think he inspired me in many ways, including to try and start a counterpart organization in India. And really to spread the word about this really important relationship among the common people, among the the greater, I think, populations of our country. But this really is an important relationship. So this session that I'm chairing, this is on its reflections on the 70 years of the relationship, and it seems to be like we're looking, from a sort of a retrospective view. But I think we've all built over the years. This relationship has been built by many people, leading to where it is now. And while we have three very eminent speakers, and I'll be introducing them as they speak, I would wish them to look, of course, at the milestones, but also where we stand now, and what are the prospects for the future. Because I think one thing about this relationship that we talk about is so much has happened, and a lot in the last 2 decades that Ambassador Hirabayashi talked about. Much has happened. But there is also this potential. We keep talking about the potential to be realized. So I think there is a long way ahead and a lot of exciting new areas that are coming up. Now, this session has been very logically organized. It talks about the political relationship we will have, and then we will have a focus on the economic relationship and the defense and the strategic relationship. The first topic, we have Professor Purnendra Jain, who had the pleasure of meeting when I was in Tokyo, who will be talking about, very interestingly, the topic is from Yoshida to Kishida. And I think this is interesting because it talks about the personalities in this relationship. Of course, there were the very the compelling factors why Japan and India came together, particularly the first decade, which was sort of the golden decade, and then of course what we have seen since the beginning of this century. But personalities played such an important role. And when we think of personalities in that first decade, I think, and we're looking back, certainly Prime Minister Nehru, whom Ambassador Hirabayashi spoke about, and also Prime Minister Kishi, who was Prime Minister Abe's grandfather. And we remember him for so many things. The start of ODA to India in 1958. And so there have been a lot of personalities who have had a very important role to play. And cut to the 2000s. Again, as Prime Minister Hirabayashi said, there was Prime Minister Modi, there's Prime Minister Koizumi, who we tend to forget a bit. But a lot of the major infrastructure projects, major economic, I think, the structures that we have today for cooperation, as well as the strategic relationship, really came out of a working group that was set up during his time, during his visit when he came. And then Prime Minister Abe, I think everybody in India, if you ask today, if I talk about Japan, they remember Prime Minister Abe the most because of his contribution in not only building the relationship, but also including India in the growth story of Asia and the Indo-Pacific, and bringing us in through the concept of the Indo-Pacific, as well as now, of course, the Quad, which, as we know, we go into a summit soon, and which is really moved in a very, very, not an intangible, but is now delivering tangibles. It's not only ideas, we're seeing things that are happening on ground. So this has been a very exciting period. We have the economic relationship. There's much which has happened, but there is much, much more which can happen. And, Professor Roy Choudhury will be talking about it. My first introduction to her was not physically, but through a paper she had written when she tried to analyze the SEPA that we had, the first comprehensive economic partnership agreement we had with any OECD country. And she analyzed that, and she was actually commissioned to do that by the Japanese and not the Indian side. And, it hasn't delivered as we expected. A lot has happened, I must say. And I think we really look to Japan to kind of be a partner of transformation of the Indian economy. But there is really much that has to be done. Recently, when Prime Minister Kishida came for the summit, and Ambassador Verma talks about this 5 trillion, promise of this 5 trillion, investment, both public and private, into India. I mean, earlier there was a 3.5 trillion yen investment that was, which fructified, which happened. And this was an announcement made when Prime Minister Modi first visited Japan in 2014 when I was there. And now this is a second tranche. This is extremely important to India. But I think this is an area where much has happened and much more can happen. And I think some of the areas were also mentioned by CDA, Kawazu-san, Ambassador Verma, and Ambassador Hirabayashi. And then we have a session which is going to be on security and defense ties. And here is where progress has been just quite amazing, from almost nothing, I should say, about 15 years ago, to where we are today, where we have joint exercises across the 3 arms of the military. We have naval exercises with other countries. We have very major agreements that we've entered into. And so this is one area where I always feel is very marked, because the progress has been very, very fast. And normally, I think what happens in many areas with Japan and India, for various reasons, is that progress is often less at a slower pace than most of us who believe in this relationship would like it to be. So with those few words of introduction, I'm going to go over to Professor Purnendra Jain, who is going to talk about mapping 7 decades of India-Japan relations from Yoshida to Kishida. I'll very briefly introduce him. Professor Jain is an Emeritus Professor in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Adelaide. His main research focus has been contemporary Japanese politics and foreign policy. He's an author, co-author, and editor. I see, is there an echo? Can you hear me clearly? I hope, is it okay? Right. So he's an author, co-author, and editor of 14 books and numerous research papers and articles. And he has written extensively on international relations in the Indo-Pacific region. His latest co-edited book is Japan's Foreign Policy in the 21st Century. Over to you, Professor Jain. We look forward to hearing from you about Yoshida to Kishida.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ambassador Wadhwa, and also for recollecting our very brief meeting in Tokyo. I would like to thank the organizers at ICWA for inviting me to this virtual conference on India-Japan relations at 70. I feel deeply privileged with panelists, some of the serving and others retired Indian and Japanese diplomats, many of my colleagues in both India and Japan, and of course very delighted to meet other distinguished panelists. Greetings from Adelaide, Australia. I have already learned quite a lot from the opening remarks of Ambassador Verma as to what's happening and what's likely to happen and what are the ways forward, and also from Japanese Charge d'Affaires, Mr. Kawazu Kunihiko, and Ambassador Hirabayashi's keynote. It may be a cliche, but India-Japan relations have come, as you have mentioned, a long way, especially in the last 15 years or so. One could argue that the golden era of the 1950s has returned, albeit in somewhat different forms and shapes, befitting the contemporary international strategic environment. Now, in my presentation today, as you have mentioned, is from Yoshida to Kishida. So I will use somewhat a different lens to focus on development in the bilateral relationship, not approaching my presentation via a specific issue or through an overall assessment of the relationship, as many of the distinguished panelists would do today, and some of them have already done today. So rather, I would like to look at political leadership, focusing specifically on some Japanese prime ministers, what I call from Yoshida to Kishida, in developing and strengthening the bilateral relationship. The role of leadership is an established line of analytical frame in the field of foreign policy analysis, and my presentation is simply an exploratory attempt based on available literature. Archival work and personal interviews are needed to reach definitive answers or conclusions. I am not touching on Indian prime ministers here. This will be, of course, an important exercise as well. I am assuming that Indian prime ministers have generally been positive about Japan and willing to build relations with Tokyo, barring a few occasions when the Indian side felt hugely disappointed and even annoyed with Japan. The 1962 war with China and the 1998 nuclear tests are obvious examples. On the Japanese side, though, some prime ministers have been genuinely interested in India, others simply passive, disinterested, or even uninterested, while some held a rather pretty negative view of India, bordering an anti-India attitude. Let me today briefly talk about some of the most critical Japanese prime ministers whose administrations provided inflection points in the relationship. A former Japanese ambassador to India commented once that the first and brightest period in Indo-Japan relations was the period from India's independence till 1961. So I would like to say that this between India's independence and 1961, I pick up two prime ministers in particular. First one is Yoshida Shigeru, who was a long-serving prime minister from 1946-47 and from 1948 to 1954, 7 years in office, roughly. So it was during his administration that the historic India-Japan Peace Treaty was signed in June 1952. This was, of course, a great moment in the bilateral relationship. We are, of course, celebrating this year as the 70th anniversary of this treaty. India offered a most generous terms to the Japanese, which Japan acknowledges and recognizes even today. It generated a huge amount of goodwill, but not much details are available, unfortunately, beyond this fact. Since Yoshida's retirement in 1954 to this day, Japan has had some 31 prime ministers in roughly 66 years, with an average lifespan of just 2 years. Some served, of course, longer and some very short. So the second prime minister of note is Nobusuke Kishi. And Madam Chair, you mentioned about him. He served as Japan's prime minister for 3.5 years. He would have, in my view, and many analysts would agree, would have continued longer if not forced to resign due to deep political crisis in 1960 in Japan. Kishi was the first prime minister to visit India in 1957, reciprocated by Prime Minister Nehru in the same year. Much has been written about these visits. The enthusiasm and a groundswell of goodwill on both sides have been well documented. In the Kishi vision of Asianism or Ajia Shugi, India was central. So it was not surprising that he visited India and invited Nehru to Japan. Kishi's historic address from the rampart of the Red Fort and Nehru's most enthusiastic reception in Tokyo were matched, I would think, only recently when Abe was Japan's prime minister. Very little happened under subsequent prime ministers. In fact, the successor of Kishi, Mr. Hayato Ikeda, who served as prime minister for 4 years, he visited India in 1961. But he did not see much potential of India for Japan, as his focus was economic growth, and who, incidentally, the French president dubbed the transistor salesman. So in his view, India did not fit in his income doubling plan for Japan. Then came the long administration of Eisaku Sato from 1964 to 1972. From the same, he is brother of Prime Minister Kishi. Of course, they have different surnames because of adoption in a different family, but both were born Sato. So Mr. Sato was more conservative than Mr. Kishi and very pro-Western and at the same time anti-China. But he favored the expansion of economic ties with China. So India hardly figured on his diplomatic radar, if you like. Not much happened when Sato was prime minister for a very long period of time. Quickly, now I move to another prime minister, Mr. Nakasone Yasuhiro, who visited India in May 1984 after a gap of 23 years since Ikeda's visit in 1961. Now, under Nakasone, it seemed that things were warming up and things were going to go in the right direction because he came twice. First, he visited in May 1984, then he came again to pay his last respects to Mrs. Gandhi, who was assassinated in October 1984. So we see Nakasone was a person who served as prime minister for a long period of time, and he saw India, some potential for India, and Nakasone was also trying to play a role of bridging between the West, between the West and East. That is, as member of G7 countries, he wanted to be a bridge, or Japan. He would like Japan to be a bridge between the East and West, and he could recognize and acknowledge India's importance in that. As a matter of fact, during his period, we saw lots of economic activities taking place. And then when Mr. Rajiv Gandhi came as prime minister, he also visited Japan on a couple of occasions. But everything kind of came to a very different trajectory, especially after 1998. So in 1998, we all know what happened, and Mr. Ambassador Hirabayashi has mentioned he was ambassador of Japan in India at that time, and they tried to rescue the relationship which was done with the visit of Mr. Mori. And Madam, you have mentioned quite rightly that we don't talk much about Mr. Mori, although of course he was the one who made a special crucial, who gave a crucial turn to the relationship, and of course Mr. Hirabayashi's role was quite significant there. But the 1990s was also a period of kind of lull between the two countries. Things were happening, but not much. So Modi's visit was a real turning point in the beginning of the 21st century, and we need to know and work a little bit more about Mr. Mori. So next is Koizumi. Again, he has been mentioned by our keynote speaker as well as our colleagues who gave opening remark, including Madam Chairman. She mentioned about Mr. Koizumi. But of course, I don't need to list the two nations have really achieved during Abe's premiership. As this panel knows even much more than I know about this relationship under Mr. Abe. And Mr. Abe and Mr. Singh to begin with, then the Abe-Modi romance, if you like, it was quite a significant period in India-Japan relationship. But, one hypothesis which I want to make, it may not be tested correctly, but I have seen that prime ministers in Japan who have served longer period of time, they have made some critical turning points in the bilateral relationship, although of course Prime Minister Mori is an exception to this. So if you look at Prime Ministers Yoshida, Kishi, Nakasone, Koizumi, Mr. Abe, all longer serving prime ministers in Japan. So in my view, actually, this could be a fascinating research area. And I would hope that either in India or in Japan or in both countries, there will be young PhD scholars who dig deep into the leadership role and look at the Japanese political leaders' role as well as the Indian political leaders' role historically and contemporarily as to what kind of role they have played. Now, the point is that we have already talked about Prime Minister Kishida, his visit. I don't need to repeat anything there. I think today the relationship stands on a very solid ground. And the good thing is that the relationship has been institutionalized. Of course, individual leaders, personalities, prime ministers, ambassadors, they play critical roles. But if we have developed institutions, I think the foundation has become much stronger to build further floors on these foundations. And I would only hope that Mr. Kishida, continues in this position long enough for him to have enough time to think anew as to where the relationship Japan wants to take with India. I think I would end there. I think my time is over as well. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Jain. That was really interesting, very interesting perspective. In the sense, particularly your theory that the longer the prime ministers were, in position, the more they contributed, perhaps had time to look at this relationship rather than the main alliance partners that they have. And this period of, I think what you are really saying is that, Japan, if we had, of course, I think after the golden period, about 4 decades of, stability. I mean, there weren't great, peaks or anything in the relationship. And our ODA was really the ballast of the relationship that saw us through that period. But that was also because I think Japan was focusing on its economy, the Cold War had come, And I think one big reason also was that China looms so large on the radar of Japan that, they didn't have time to look at us. But I do agree with you that the institutional foundations are very strong now, and that we hope that the Prime Ministers will last on both sides and build this relationship. Thank you very much. I now go on to Professor Srabani Roy Choudhury, who will be talking about deconstructing the economic partnership. Over to you, Srabani. Sorry, I haven't introduced you. I know you so well that I almost presume everybody does. Okay. So Dr. Srabani Roy Choudhury is a professor and Chair, Center for East Asian Studies, School for International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She really is the person to go to for the for her papers on India-Japan economic relationship, and her research interest is it's actually very sort of goes into deeply into areas such as Japanese investment into India. Her recent publications are centered on economic diplomacy, as we could imagine, but I must say very recently she's brought out, I think very topically at really an opportune moment, an edited volume of Japan, India at 70, Building Beyond the Bilateral, which I would recommend to everybody because it brings a lot of young scholars and covers a huge gamut of issues. And, it's really anybody who's interested in Japan should be able to read the articles written and edited by Professor Roy Choudhury. So over to you, Srabani. You're mute, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you, ma'am, for your kind introduction and also promoting my book. Thank you, ICWA, especially Director Vijay Thakur Singh, for giving me this opportunity through this forum. And I'm very honored to be in a very eminent group of people today. And I look forward to having a great outing today with all of you. Of course, the keynote address followed by the remarks that has been done during the inaugural session actually makes my life easier because I can skip a lot of what has been said and concentrate more on what I would like to just tell about the relationship. Are my slides visible, please?
They're visible.
Okay. Thank you. This is what I'll be looking at, deconstructing the economic partnership between Japan and India. The contents would obviously move through history. I would look into the CEPA, as ma'am has already said, has been my research findings a decade ago. Then the economic partnership as it exists today, looking into it through the JEPIC and the JETRO surveys that has come in through 2021 and 2022, and look at the prospects that we could have. History, as all of you know, the trade between India and Japan can be traced back to 1984 when they signed the trade convention. And we do know that during the pre-Cold War, Second World War, the relationship grew on the cotton and the iron exports. And India was one of the fourth largest exporter to Japan. Following the Second World War, we of course had the relationship going, as it's been said, as a golden period, because we did export a lot of iron to Japan, and Japan's economic miracle, India did contribute to its economic miracle at one point of time. The official development assistance began in 1958, and this is probably the time that we would say that the only bridge that was built during this inactive period that we had till around the 1990 was this issue of ODA that sort of kept the relationship going. But however, it is in 2000 that India-Japan Global Partnership of the 21st century, which was inked between our Prime Minister Vajpayee and our Prime Minister Mori of Japan, probably sets the tone for what we see today. And I would say that this was the real turning point for the economic partnership. I look at pre-2011 because 2011 is the year that we signed the CEPA. In the 80s, Japanese companies were allowed to enter through a small window of JVs, which was basically a technology transfer route, which started by our Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. And of course, it is also the period of time that Maruti Suzuki grew, and we in our country saw a Japanese car make an entry as a small family car. And the image of Japan really was on that Maruti car. opening up the Indian economy on the various sector of 1991 onwards, especially as Hibayashi's ambassador said that, 1991, we got the loan from Japan, which actually allowed us to move in the right direction. And significantly, there was a drive to attract FDI from across the world, and Japanese FDI quadruple, and that you can see in one of my figures out here, which is the arrow that shows the red and how it grew. The companies that came in seems to be very traditional Japanese companies at this point of time. You have the auto companies and a few telecommunication and electronic companies. Why is it not moving? Is it? Yeah. I'll keep it at this. I think it's because of the internet connectivity issue. If you look at the economic partnership agreement, we've said that in 10 years' time, we would be abolishing our tariff barriers such that, we would have an exchange in form of essentially investment, not only trade, not only in goods, but also services. And we would also look at investments across various sectors. At that point of time, you had a Japan study group report, which actually reported opportunities and strength of India-Japan economic partnership. And if you look at the areas that was identified, you realize that even today, while we do talk about new as the areas of opportunities that has risen, it would basically be involving similar kind of structure that has been identified in 2011. Potential industries for investments, if you see the list, what is important for us to notice, apart from electrical electronics, it was identified that healthcare would be an important area, and medical tourism was actually what one was heading towards. But healthcare, as the COVID situation, bifurcated it into PPE and also vaccine issues. So, which is what is interesting, because you identified certain sector which would be useful in a certain way, but there are other ways that often originate because of the changing scenario. Food packaging is yet another sector which is recently been getting much more attention, and we would later see what are the new areas that came up. My research findings, which was pretty similar to what Gbc and JETRO continued to project during the entire till around 2012, is land acquisition, a strong need to provide continuity in policies, working towards removal of bottlenecks in administration through probably enabled procedures, which has actually taken off very well during the COVID and post-COVID. More transparency in taxation and priority towards infrastructure development, technical orientation, and public partnership, private partnership. Between these, while the CPA was being worked at, we had two important things that happened. One was inclusion of strategic partnership into the joint statement, and that was basically done after the 8 initiative that was inked by Koizumi and followed by Abe's strategic partnership. The strategic partnership actually oriented the economic partnership into different direction, and this is where I feel that the real amalgamation between the two countries really took forward at the government level. Followed this, of course, we have the 2014, the special strategic partnership, and as it has been said, the special was supposed to be the bond that India and Japan shared. I would like to say that the special is also been the reason why a certain institutional structures, ministerial meetings, larger number of working groups was probably inked, because we have had this special component to be looked at from different angles also. So let's look at India-Japan economic partnership between the 2020 and 2022. I would essentially out here be looking at two important pillars which actually work from Japan front in any country, that is the Gbc and the JETRO. They have come up with surveys, one in 2021, which JETRO would also bring it in 2022. It's awaited, but the March 2022 Gbc surveys out, so I would use those data. But also, I would like to let you know that JICA, which looks into the ODA, is of course this other pillar, which is the strongest pillar that we have between India and Japan. And it is this pillar which is actually working hard, in a absolute speed to put the strategic component into our economic partnership. Unfortunately, while when we discuss a partnership, we need to talk about trade, investment, and ODA. Trade has not been an area where we would work out. We expected a lot after the CEPA, but somehow it has not worked out. We have the India Exim Bank's report on the enhancing of trade relationship. And if you look at it, our composition still continues to be the same, petroleum, refined petroleum, diamonds, some amount of jewelry. We have not really been able to expand this basket. Concerns continue to plague us while, the post-COVID, India's exports to Japan has increased because India's import from Japan has decreased, mainly because I think shrinking of the economy that happened due to need of automobile, etc., which shrunk. And therefore, we have our trade deficit seems to be lesser. But unfortunately, this is one area where we probably would have to ask ourselves why we were not able to integrate, as much as Japan has to ask itself to know why they have not been able to allow Indian imports into their country, considering we are doing quite well in some other countries. This is the best story that one can talk about as far as India-Japan economic partnership grows, is that way we have the number of Japanese companies that have come into. Statistically, this is interestingly, going upwards. You feel excited about it. But if you really compare it to the other nations, especially when you look at right now decoupling of from China, Japanese companies have yet to look at Thailand, look at India. They're rather going to Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And this is why I say that this is statistically very convenient to place, and that we're having a great outing. But we as people who really want to make a presence of Japanese companies in India should really ask ourselves how we can strengthen ourselves further. With foreign direct investments, of course, there has been spikes and falls in the 2020s has essentially been because of the concern of the COVID situation, how we all looked inward, and finally we are trying to again look outward. But this COVID has also been very instrumental in creating newer areas where corporations would develop, and I would get into that shortly. Trends in ODA commitment is known to all of us. The ODA commitments has been strong, but let me just tell two things that I would like to bring forward out here is how it has moved towards a strategic investment. Two projects that have a strong bearing is obviously the Northeast road connectivity that we've much talked about, the Northeast being a way to move towards Indo-Pacific. Then we have the diesel power plant that has been allowed to be put up by the Japanese ODA in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Let me tell participants who are not aware that Andaman Nicobar Islands is strategically a very important place because it links us to the Malacca Strait, and also that it is one of those places where foreign investments are not allowed, and Japan is one of only country that has been allowed to do so. Along with it is the submarine cable laying that is happening in and around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which I'm sure the security, Professor Naidu would take it up in his security concerns. The major road development program of Northeast Asia is going to be a major linkages for the hitherland, landlocked countries who are our neighbors, and would become a very important way of integrating with the ASEAN countries. And I think this is one place where a lot of sustainable development industrializations can happen, which has been identified in the form of farming like mushroom cultivating, as well as large amount of bamboo, etc., that has been identified. As late as March 2022, the overview of yen loan projects that has been under discussions are on the slides for you. It moves from healthcare system to water, sewage, humanitarian concerns to freight corridor projects, which is essentially something to do with connectivity and has a strategic component, to biodiversity, Uttarakhand's integrated horticulture development, and Chennai metro projects. If you look at it, the basket is enormous. Areas in which Japan will impact our country is not only with respect to infrastructure developments, but also with sustainable developments, like for instance, with respect to sewage, water supply, greening projects, etc., means that Japan is well entrenched in our lives today. And we actually would be looking at furthering this through the ODA program. But while the ODA is important, it is important for us to note that when Kishida's current loan that has come to India talks about private-public partnership, I think the importance is to gain cooperation in this private-public partnership at ground level. And this is why I would say that the institutional mechanism of Japan Help Desk and Act East Forum is probably being very well established as far as in the economic thing, giving a good source where Japanese as well as Indian entrepreneurs can reach out and try to know how to do things better. However, having said all this, I would like to point out that probably the mechanisms are in place somehow at the ground level. We'll have to find ways of giving a momentum to the ground level exercises such that it really becomes much more of an act than a policy, because as both the ambassadors today said, the policies that are in place, the industrial cooperation policies, the ministerial meetings that have constantly, the working groups with critical technologies in almost all fields have shown that India and Japan has a great potential of growth in areas. But how is it looking from the JETRO survey of 2021? It is interesting that India is considered to be the country that has really moved out for the Japanese companies who are profitable out of the zone of losses in the 2021, that is post-COVID. It is also very critical to see that, proportion of companies expecting an expansion in the next 2 years, that is from 2021 to 2023. Both India companies are high above most of the other nations, which is a good indicator that there is a lot of feeling of, good factor as far as Indian economic policies as well as the business environment goes for the Japanese company. On the rebound, if you were to look a little on the other side, this is a little dated, I could not find a more current thing, that we have around 24 Indian companies who are operating in Japan as of 2019. I'm sure there would be a few more added by now, which, if you look at the combination, is considered more on the services sector and would have a very important role to play in attracting investment into India, because as Japanese understand to work with India in their own ecosystem, they would probably be more encouraged to come to India to work out here. The GBC report of 2022 claims that the reasons what is impacting Japanese companies in India are increased wages, which is naturally happening because of the economic conditions that we are in, growing market shares of competitors, and this is somewhere where Japanese companies are really feeling the heat from the Korean companies. But complicated and time-consuming customs clearance continue to, be something that was declared in 2021, continues to still impact the decisions of, working out here, and quality of employees. Quality of employees, in spite of the fact that, Japanese, whenever we have gone into a economic development program with Make in India, Skill India, Japanese have come to us integrating their way of helping India by integrating our economic and developmental needs into their way of assistance, seems to have still not made an impact at the ground level. However, as I said, we started with a set of lists, but new list of companies which have areas that have been brought into it is through the startup mantra. That is the digital transformation that we are looking at, information of technology, or IoT that we call today, but critical technologies in the form of artificial intelligence, quantum technology, and green technology, which all in a way are looking at sustainable development options, is probably the areas where India and Japan would be collaborating in much more, futuristic way, such that India's industrialization, Japan's policy of society 5.0 would integrate itself to create a nexus within the two nations' business world, such that we would be able to move forward in the right direction that the world would probably need. Prospects for this relationship, as I look today, the demographic dividend of India needs to be harnessed by Japan. And as late as 2 days back, when Japan came up with its population issue, the children not having, falling, the number of children in the country falling in the 41st year from when they've been, taking this into their demographic data. It tells us a lot about how India's big demographic thing can be used even for the purpose of even establishing educational institutes in India. Potential exists obviously in manufacturing sectors, and it is time now to go down to the ground level operations. In some cases, India is actually leading the new age technology, for instance, digitalization. And I think Japan can do a lot by gaining expertise of Indian expertise for them. Directions have been given, visas, extension options for business, and long stay has been already in place by Japanese government. We expect probably much more in future on this. Decoupling from China, and much of interest that we all look forward from an academic point of view is to see how we can strongly push for an Indian engagement from Japan, in spite of the fact that India today considers to be the second most important country for investment by the Gbc report of 2022. However, moving from China, when you see the list, it is usually Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and that really worries me. And I think delegations should actually try to make inroads into pushing for India as an alternative to Japanese business. Opportunities through Quad would probably is something that we should really explore. We have the resilient supply chain management in place. We have the vaccine diplomacy to be considered. In fact, the 8 pillars that has been working groups that has been identified in Quad also seems to be there when our joint statement was inked with Suga. And I therefore think that, since there's so much of convergence between what Quad and India-Japan bilateral looks at, as I said in my edited book, that looking beyond the bilateralism would be what would be the next challenge. But looking within the bilateralism in pursuing business to look at India in a more constructive fashion should be the agenda, I think, that we should set ourselves as an immediate goal. Thank you for your attention, and thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Srabani. Very, very interesting indeed. I mean, identify the industries, the opportunities, the challenges. And I think what is very interesting, what I took away from what you said was how this, the strategic partnership and how, in fact, it's catalyzed the economic relationship. And you particularly mentioned really the economic relationship and the partnership in, what are sensitive strategic peripheries of India, the Northeast and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And I think this is something most people do not know about, but this is really important, the trust factor that is there with Japan. And, there is a need for momentum, as we all do realize. And I do hope this economic relationship, which has all the potential, all the complementarities, can move forward. Now I move on to Professor Gbc Naidu. We'll introduce him. He's a former founder chairperson of the Center for Indo-Pacific Studies at the School of International Studies at JNU. He specializes in Indo-Pacific affairs, including political economy, maritime security, regional multilateralism, and India's engagement in the region. He has to his credit several books and monographs and more than 150 articles and research papers published in India and abroad. Professor Naidu is going to talk about a very interesting area, which is looking at the relations over the last 70 years from a defense and strategic perspective. I do hope, Professor Naidu, after we hear from you, we will have a few minutes left for a few questions also from our audience. But thank you very much, and over to you.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you, Chairperson. I would like to express my sincere thanks to ICW. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank
Okay,
you.
okay. Sincere thanks to Ambassador Singh and John Josin for this opportunity to share my views on this topic. Quite a few things that I wanted to have been said, so that will make my task easier, and also not to take too much time, so that we have sufficient time for question and answers. I assume Professor Jain is still around. He mentioned an interesting point about the tenure of the prime ministers and the improvement in bilateral relations. I also had similar kind of thinking in terms of looking at bilateral relations for quite some time. In addition to the longer terms, many of these people had, they also share two other traits, commonly shared characteristics. One is they're all right-wingers. Number two, they all hate China. They're all China haters. Probably that contributed, quite a bit to, their attitude towards India. I've not done serious research on that. It's just an idea. Little backdrop to the remarkable turnaround, as Chairperson rightly pointed out a little while back, about defense and strategic relations between India and Japan. Of course, the 70 years of India-Japan diplomatic relations, the key aspect is that the signing of the peace agreement between India and Japan, establishing diplomatic relations. The import of this agreement lies in the fact that this was the first international agreement that Japan has signed after the San Francisco treaty and all that. So that diplomatically, from a Japanese perspective, it's very, very important. Now we all know that 1950s was the best time, golden era. We had excellent relations, especially Prime Minister Kishida. I was very, very enthusiastic, but unfortunately momentum lost steam, very soon, partly because of series of incidents, partly because of the intensification of the Cold War, and partly because of the series of wars India had to fight, and partly because, for whatever reason, starting from mid-50s onwards, you could see that clearly India losing interest vis-a-vis East Asia. So if you really look at the entire spectrum of remarkable turnaround in India-Japan relations, is less than just about 2 decades old. And within that, in the broad framework of things, the one area that really has taken off is the defense and strategic relationship. But unfortunately, the economic relations still they're not really come up to the level of one would expect between the two countries like India and Japan. There could be any other reasons, but unless that leg is strengthened, the strategic relationship will always be extremely focused, limited to certain areas. And anyway, that's not my area of focus. So post Cold War, that's I think the really time when India and Japan started really getting closer. So initially, if you really look at once the Cold War ended, that was also the time there's a lot of rethinking within Japan about its own future in terms of what is going to be the alliance partnership with the US, because US was the Cold War ended, US was ready to withdraw lots of troops all around the world, and including from East Asia. In fact, at one point of time, America had nearly 500,000 troops in East Asia. That got reduced to less than 100,000. By the time the Cold War came to an end. So there was I was there in the early 1990s. I spent a year in Japan. There were a lot of concerns about what was going to be the American involvement and role in East Asia. And what should Japan do? Some, of course, went to the extent of saying that it's the end of the Cold War. We don't require the American troops, and it's time we don't have any issues with anybody. We are friendly with China. It's coming up as reforms and all that. That is one side. The other side, you also had people really concerned about security of Japan. So this was the time a lot of debate took place, and one of the things that Japan came up with was that create regional multilateralism and start playing a bigger role in it. So that's how Japan came up with a series of ideas. Not many people really appreciate that, from APEC to ARF, and a number of free trade agreements. More recently, are all Japanese ideas. Okay, so on the economic front, they thought economic cooperation, the immense potential, and Japan could play a bigger role in. And regional security issues, through multilateralism, allowing ASEAN to lead this security multilateralism, Japan could play a bigger role in. So that was the kind of rough policy Japan began to adopt. At the same time, ensuring that American troops, even some amount of minimal presence remains in Japan. So that was the time. Also, India started re-looking at East Asia and started launched the Look East policy. And in fact, if you really look at very interesting that Japan looked at India's greater involvement or attempts to involve in regional affairs as as a kind of potential competitor. So Japan cold-shouldered almost every move India made in terms of getting closer to Japan, including investments and the famous delegation that came and they felt that there's nothing in India to really warrant investments and all that, and that's a different issue. But one issue that really came in between in a big way was the 1998 nuclear tests. Japan went all out, I'm sure, most of you are quite aware, not only they imposed the economic sanctions, they tried their best to isolate India diplomatically. Hirabayashi was the ambassador in India, and I was in IDS at that time. We had a lot of interactions. But very soon, within a matter of year and a half, you could see a complete turnaround in Japan's attitude towards India. Two things that made Japan to revisit India. One is the 1999 Alondra rainbow incident, a Japanese freighter that was hijacked, and Indian Navy and Coast Guard, in a very highly coordinated activity, it captured it, and the hijackers were arrested. So that incident really made Japan to think that India, with its strategic location in the Indian Ocean, will play a crucial role in ensuring the security of sea lanes of communication. Second important development was post nuclear tests. The way USA quickly came around, started engaging India. Started in London, the secret talks and all that, but it came out into the open. They realized that America doesn't have any issue with India going nuclear. Much of it was American concern was more about Pakistan, safety of Pakistan nuclear weapons. So why should we have So that really made Prime Minister Modi to make an unexpected trip to India in August 2000. That really was the very, very important visit. That was the beginning of relationship undergoing a major transformation. And of course, Koizumi visit, he came out with the 8-point initiative that really set the stage for remarkable improvement in bilateral relations. Ever since, if you really look at, starting from the late 1990s and early 2000s onwards till now, one common theme that runs through the entire relationship is the regional security. whether you, and earlier it was East Asia, now Indo-Pacific. So that geopolitical issues have been one common theme that really, the mainstay or the main driver of India-Japan bilateral strategic partnership. I've given some examples, just looking at, examined the bilateral relationship the joint statements in 2005. I'm just giving you some examples in India-Japan partnership in a new Asian area, strategic orientation of Japan-India global partnership. In 2006, joint statement says strategic partnership and special strategic partnership in 2014, and basically it gives a lot of references to Asia if you go through this one. 2015, more recently, I've skipped in between. Special strategic and global partnership working together for peace and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region and the world. So East Asia, Indo-Pacific, more recently, it's a common theme, that really one sees in bilateral very prominently in a detailed fashion. So what is that has made Japan to a partner with India on regional security? If you really look at shared objectives in the Indo-Pacific, I use the Indo-Pacific because that is the current the phrase that is being extensively used in. Geostrategic and geoeconomic stakes are very high for both India and Japan. And they also share numerous common interests and concerns. In Indo-Pacific presents at the same time, two contrasting scenarios. It is economically the world's most vibrant region. Largest number of bilateral, minilateral, and multilateral free trade agreements are testimony to the fact that it is the world's most dynamic region economically. And there is a robust value chain, which has been talked a lot nowadays due to pandemic disruptions. And intra-regional interdependence is growing phenomenally. It's almost nearly 60% intra-regional economic cooperation in terms of trade. And similarly, investments. This is the largest market and is an expanding market. And it's already has emerged as the principal driver of global economy. It is already the center of gravity in more than one sense. And at the same time, it is also beset with a number of security issues. There are the largest number of territorial maritime boundary disputes are in the Indo-Pacific. There are fundamental power shifts due to the rise of new power center. This is also the reason for the first time one sees 3 Asian powers rising almost simultaneously, which has never happened. Especially from a Japanese perspective. Japan is China had always been a continental power. It never posed a threat to Japan in that sense. But that is fundamentally a change. That's one of the biggest worries Japan is faced with. And then despite all the talk about rebalancing and pivot to Asia and free and all the open Indo-Pacific, all that, but USA, if really look at last more than 2 decades, is still preoccupied with other regions, either the Middle East and then Afghanistan, when they were really beginning to look at Indo-Pacific, now Ukraine war. And there's also huge historical baggage. Every country, especially in East Asia, rising powers are expanding their strategic footprints, and thus potential clash of interests is huge. And there is also there is an absence of stable balance of power. That probably one of the factors that creates a lot of uncertainty. Security multilateralism is not making much dent, and if you really look at early 1990s, the way ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, whole lot of other things, ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, plus and whole lot of other things came, but they have not really come up to the level where regional security can be tackled or addressed to the extent possible, either in traditional sense or even non-traditional sense in dealing with regional security issues. Probably that's the reason why Quad has come up. Quad 2.0 has been revived. AUKUS is a military pact. Again, this is an indication that regional multilateralism is not really going to help much. Very quickly, I'll come to the next part of my presentation: India-Japan security cooperation. Sorry. 2 important declarations I would like to mention here: 2008 Joint Declaration on Security Cooperation between India and Japan, and second 2009 Action Plan to Advance Security Cooperation. This really laid the foundation for India and Japan to take the defense and strategic partnership forward. There are a number of institutional mechanisms created to strengthen the bilateral relationship, strategic partnership. Most of them are, almost all of them are entirely focused on security related aspects. I'm sure most of you are quite aware, annual PM's meeting 2+2, that has emerged as the most important, the bilateral forum. And there are consultations at the foreign secretary level, annual foreign office consultations, security, whole lot of other things like there are about 14 of them by last count, purely on defense and strategic issues. These are some of the institutional mechanisms that have been created. There is a annual comprehensive security dialogue. There is a defense policy dialogue, military to military talks, regular visits by, it's an annual, most of them are annual events, giant exercises, I'll come to that little later. And then exchange of military officers for training, coordination of Indian Ocean anti-piracy. We saw that in the Somali anti-piracy, India and Japan closely cooperated. There's also a giant commission that has been created more recently on transfer of advanced technologies. So in terms of defense cooperation, defense links began to take off with Malabar exercises in 2007. That those were the some of the most militarily significant exercises. For the first time, Japan participated, which was otherwise basically bilateral between India and the US. And Shinzo Abe, of course, the famous address to the Indian Parliament, Confluence of the Two Seas, from which the Indo-Pacific construct came into existence. And then I have identified broadly 4 categories of defense cooperation. One is exercises. There are 2 types of exercises that India and Japan they hold. One is bilateral, started with Coast Guard. Now, of course, they have been extended to Navy to Navy, and also to the military and Army to Army and Air Force to Air Force. But the significant ones are the maritime exercises, Navy to Navy. Bilateral, initially limited to Coast Guard. Now they call it GMEX exercises. Malabar, these are multilateral exercises. So earlier it used to be 3. One occasion there were 5. Now it has become 4. Australia joined. And second is security dialogues. A number of security dialogue that India and Japan they hold. A variety of them. Of course, 2+2 dialogue is the most important one. And defense, defense policy dialogue between defense secretaries, military to talks and regular visits are very significant ones. Training is relatively a recent phenomenon. Middle to senior level officer are exchanged for training purpose.
Mr. Naidu, if you could just finish it off, you won't have time for questions, please.
Yeah, just a couple of minutes, just 2 minutes. Okay. There's also an issue about arms sales to India, but there was a lot of talk about US talks went on for several years. That deal didn't come through. Similarly, there was expectation that Japan would bid for Soryu class conventional submarines. That also didn't happen. And there's also a very important aspect. Finally, is the advanced technologies. So there is there is an agreement to basically their dual is defense-related technologies. First ever meeting took place between India and Japan, called ALTA, and Indian Defense Production in Tokyo 2017, with a number of public sector companies participating. So that probably might give an idea that in the future joint research could be one of the potential areas. There's also, I would like to briefly mention the limitations of India-Japan relations, strategic partnership, especially. There's a strong tendency to be euphoric about India-Japan strategic partnership. It's necessary to keep in mind there are limitations. Japan is part of the US alliance system. India is not. Okay, so that itself is a major constraint. The way each country would. Oops. Sorry. India will retain its, despite rapidly growing security cooperation, India is not an alliance partner. India will try to keep its strategic autonomy as much as possible. India will not do an American bidding unless its interests are deeply involved in. On China also, there are fundamental differences. The way Japanese issues, China are historical. They're different kind, than the kind of issues India has gotten. I think these are the things one should really keep in mind. It is basically a couple of, 2-3 conclusions. I know one is, India-Japan partnership is relatively a recent one, but it has really come a long way in a short time. Geopolitics has been the principal driver. It has been the most significant partnership in the Indo-Pacific. There's no question about that, And this partnership will have, huge influence the way regional security order architecture would evolve. I think that is a very, very important aspect one should keep in mind. China is a key factor, but cooperation is not, aimed at, containment or constrainment for China. It's much larger. And I think that one should really keep that in mind to ensure stable Indo-Pacific security order that doesn't undermine their common interests. I think is the main goal of India-Japan strategic partnership. They would work towards stable balance of power, and then there's a broad recognition that Japan is, a strong Japan is in India's interest. A strong Japan is in Japan's interest. With this, but there's one major limitation. If there's any war, for instance, Japan is not going to participate. Say India's wars with Pakistan or China. Similarly, India is not going to participate in, say, there is a war and caucus with China. And I think, whereas it's a different thing when it comes to Japan-US strategic alliance partnership. With this, I come to an end. Thank you. I'm sorry I overshot.
No, thank you. It was most interesting. In fact, I didn't want to really interrupt you. Thank you so much, Professor Naidu. I mean, you trace the history, strategic, not only bilateral, but beyond. And I think the last thing that you said, that there's broad recognition that a strong Japan's in India's interest and a strong India's in Japan's interest, that is really, besides geopolitics, that does drive the relationship. And this is one area, I think, despite we have talked about the limitations, that we can take satisfaction from progress in our cooperation in security, in the areas of security and defense. Jojen, I just wanted to ask you, is there time for a couple of questions? Because I know that we have overshot the time in terms of, it's past 11:45. Could we take a question or two? Because the next, I think, panels will be at 12.
One round of questions, if there are any.
So could we take, I saw somebody, I thought I saw a question from Dr. Sudeep Kumar. Srabani, I think this is addressed to you. Could you just check it? I just saw it come up. Any questions from the audience? Joji, could you just check and read it out, because I'm not able to access it because of the slide. There was a question to you. Can you see it? You're muted. Srabani, you're muted. You'll have to, we can't hear you.
Wait. Yeah, sorry. This is going back into the mute form. The question is basically why we haven't joined the CPTPP and why did we withdraw from RCEP. Issues of RCEP is a little complicated out here because we had 13 rounds when we had progressed towards hoping to be part of RCEP, but there are certain conditions in RCEP which does not favor us at the moment. And that's why the withdrawal, not only with respect to Chinese products, but also with respect to Australia and New Zealand's products, mainly milk and cheese, which could have been detrimental for our economy. And that was the reason why it was said so. With CPTPP, the issue is a larger because it's supposed to be, coming up with a gold standard as far as the trade agreements go. Japan has shown a huge leadership in this, and I think one of the foremost way that Japan has put forward its position in the economic dimension within the world economy is this how it carried this CPTPP in spite of USA leaving, because it was USA which was supposed to drive this. And I think this is commendable from Japan's point of view, and we have a lot of countries, as you have said in the thing, that UK is looking, Taiwan and South Korea, more ASEAN countries are willing to join. But I think it has issues with respect to, issues with respect to data sharing India is going to go in for our CPTPP. There is a data sharing concern that we have. We have a concern of if we integrate, we might actually lose out on certain exports that we have, or our own economic SMEs and MSMEs would be in danger of competition from which would have a comparative advantage when it comes from other countries. So these are complicated issues. There's work going on. Of course, withdrawing from RCEP has not been a very good indication that we've given, because when we talk about economically integrating with the international order, it does mean getting closer to these kind of big mega trade agreements that's come up in both Asia and Pacific region. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Srabani. I'm afraid that we don't have time for more questions, but you have a full day of, I think we're going to hear a lot of speakers, and you'll have an opportunity to raise these questions. So I will leave it at that. And just to say, in concluding this session, that our strength of the relationship is really, besides political, economic, and strategic convergences, I think very importantly, and I'm sure others will speak about it, is bipartisan political support for the strengthening of this relationship in both countries. We've seen governments come and governments go, and prime ministers come and prime ministers go. But I think the fact that the Indo-Japan relationship is an important relationship is something everybody agreed to. And that really gives us the good feeling that this will progress in the direction that we would like. And there's also one other, I think, an element which will be perhaps spoken to about later, which is a positive public perception that there is in both countries about each other. I mean, there are a lot of other things that, globally, I think we have similar outlooks. And I think we both want to play a bigger role in world affairs. So there are a lot of things that bring us together, and there may be divergences, but even in the divergences, I see convergences if you look at the last joint statement. So we look forward to strengthening this relationship. And again, thank you very much to the ICWA, to Vijay Thakur Singh, and thank you for having us on this panel. Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the speakers for the excellent remarks, and also the audience for joining.